Then there are a few authors whose names we invoke regularly as institutional deities because of the burnish they give us. Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, who were members of the library and wrote pieces for our quarterly publication in the 1920s. John Dos Passos, who is said to have composed his masterwork, John Brown's Body, in the walls of the library when we were just across the street from the Palais de l'Élysée. And of course Edith Wharton, who was one of our original trustees. But perhaps the most mysterious and foundational of these minor deities was Alan Seeger. Mysterious because the poet died young, almost completely unpublished at the time of his death, and became known for one poem foretelling his own death. And foundational because his father was moved by his son's sacrifice to find a way to memorialize his son by creating with others the American Library in Paris nearly 100 years ago. Alan Seeger's skull or bust sits on my desk normally as a totem of his time, of his role in our history. But now finally we can hear from the one living person who knows more than anyone else about Alan Seeger, and to begin to separate the legend we have helped create from the actual facts. Chris Dicken is the author of the new book, A Rendezvous with Death, Alan Seeger in Poetry at War, about which he's been at work for many years, including on multiple visits to France. In fact, we met here last summer on July 4th for the 100th anniversary of Alan Seeger's death at a very moving ceremony on Place des États-Unis, where I had the privilege of reading I Have a Rendezvous with Death. So I'm very glad you're with us tonight, Chris. In addition to what Chris has to say to us, we will also have the special benefit of musical interpretations of Seeger's life from Patrick Zimmerle, who's sitting at the piano. Welcome, Patrick. He'll be offering us samples helped by Scott Emerson, who's in the audience, whose voice you will hear. He'll be offering us samples of the full oratorio of his work called Alan Seeger, Instrument of Destiny, which will be performed in full on Wednesday at the Cathédrale des Invalides.
I wanted to open the public life of this book, was published in April, but I wanted to start here as an appropriate place. It is a place of bricks, mortar, and bookshelves that are an expression of Alan Seeger and were intended to be by his family. Seeger was born in New York City in 1888. He grew up on Staten Island, just above the ferry stop at St. George. Lived for a time in Mexico with his family. His family was Unitarian. They were devoutly Unitarian as one can be. And Unitarianism at that time meant one had free will rather than being driven by God, who was going to condemn you if you did something wrong. As a Unitarian, you were accepting of human failing, and you were allowed to fail yourself as long as it was in the course of helping others to do good things in life. Alan went to the Unitarian Hackley Finishing School in Tarrytown, New York, still there. And Hackley was then a road to Harvard. He was in the Harvard class of 1910. He was fairly reclusive while he was in at Harvard. And he was educated in circles that included Walter Lippmann, who's I remember from my childhood as a very important political commentator, and T.S. Eliot. Seeger and Eliot had the same apartment on Ash Street in Cambridge, just one after the other. I'm not sure which was first and which was second, but they shared the same space. After Harvard, Seeger went on to Greenwich Village, lived right on Washington 61, South Washington Square, which is now the site of the New York University Library. He may have been clinically depressed in New York City, for all I know. He was a very difficult and unhappy person during that time, and also during some of his childhood. And he lived there in the environment of Theodore Dreiser, John Dos Passos, O. Henry, John Butler Yeats, and the like. And it turned out the reason that he was an unpleasant person and down and out in Greenwich Village was that it wasn't Paris. Because he moved here in 1912 and he thrived and flourished here. He lived with a view toward Notre Dame Cathedral at 2 addresses on the Rue du Sommerard, numbers 9 and number 17, and sort of in the shadow and the medieval spirit of the Cluny Museum. And he lived sort of as an impoverished poet boulevardier. With a couple of hundred other Americans, he joined the French Foreign Legion in a ceremony at the Hotel des Invalides and entered the war, which brought him to Toulouse, where he wrote to his mother, "I hope you see the thing as I do, and think that I have done well, being without responsibilities and with no one to suffer materially by my decision, and taking upon my shoulders too the burden that so much of humanity is suffering under, and rather than standing ingloriously aside, when the opportunity was given me, doing my share for the side that I think right." Doing what I think right was an ethic throughout this story. It was a Seeger family value. It was demonstrated particularly in the ethic of his father, Charles Sr., one of the founders of this library. And he was a semi-important figure in the modernization of Mexico during the time of Porfirio Diaz. He came out of that experience held in great esteem by many people because of his ethic of doing the right thing. And whether you agree with them politically or not, doing the right thing could be seen in the work of Alan's niece and nephew, Peggy Seeger and Pete Seeger. And even John F. Kennedy would quote Seeger in this regard in an interview with Edward R. Murrow in 1948. It was for Alan an extension of the Knight's Creed. He could see the Messier Tower of the Cluny Museum from the windows, his windows on Rue du Sommerard. And I think I've been in one of those rooms. It's now a Best Western Hotel. And it's a very nice place. The Knight's Creed, the chivalrous individual was gentle, though strong, and generous, especially to those in most need. Chivalry was a desired attribute of the military man, along with loyalty and personal honor. Valiant action was taken for the well-being of the community rather than for the benefit of the self, though the self was endowed with power to find its own destiny. Sins were contrasted with virtues, pride with wisdom, envy with faith, lust with love, and anger with hope. All was personified in the identity of the knight, whose duties included the feeding of the hungry, caretaking of the naked, sick, and homeless, and undertaking of the dead. Bodily strength was important, but courage was a matter of the spirit and without limit. The exercise of strength in battle was necessary, but not to the exclusion of actions that would enhance the qualities of the soul. The fear of death was subordinate to the fear of dishonor. This was the unflinching approach to life, and I say this now, presumably as biographer, the unflinching approach to life that Seeger followed from the moment that he marched across the Place de l'Opéra to join the Foreign Legion until the moment of his death at Boulogne-Saint-Terre. The mostly American men of the 2nd Regiment of the Foreign Legion signed their names in pencil on the white bars of the American flag that they would carry with them, and which is now, in my view, very badly displayed in the museum at the Place des Invalides. And if anybody here knows anybody there, tell them to get it protected from light and to add an English translation to the French description of the thing. It's amazing. It's the American flag over there with the French description, but no English translation, although most of their other things are. And that light thing too, if you know someone, or having home. The men marched from training at Maillet-le-Camp toward Vertus and saw the war for the first time. The burials of both French and German soldiers were marked crosses in the thousands. The trees were torn and fallen. The residents of the destroyed villages along the way stood in their streets and watched them pass by. They sang their marching song, "We are the soldiers of the Legion, the Foreign Legion, having no country, France is our mother." And they arrived at the top of Champagne and Verzenay, where Seeger sat on a curb and wrote again to his mother. From that point, he saw sunlight angling across the valley slopes and the autumn foliage. How beautiful the view is here, he wrote, over the sunny vineyards. And what a curious anomaly. On this slope, the grape pickers are singing merrily at their work. On the other, the batteries are roaring, boom, boom. The men moved on. Seeger wrote, poor ruined villages of northern France. There they lie like so many silent graveyards, each little house of the tomb of some scattered family's happiness. Where are the simple, peace-loving country folk that dwelt here when these windows were squares of yellow lamplight, not as now, blank as holes in a skull? Eventually, the men settled in the village of Crayonnel, down the road from Crayon, and beneath the California Plateau on what is known as the Chemin des Dames. It's about 150 kilometers northwest of here. And you should go there. There's a beautiful view from a wooden overlook of this whole area. And in Crayonnel, you will see behind a fence, excuse me, on a hill overlooking the village, the Chateau du Blanc Sablon. You know, I took 12 years of public school French, and I still can't get these right. So the mansion had been virtually gutted at the opening of the war. The men made it their relatively comfortable sanctuary away from their lives in the trenches, but the war surrounded them most fearfully in the night. The night sentinel, Seeger wrote, has ample time for reflection alone under the stars. War in its cosmic rather than its moral aspect reveals itself to him. But musings about the cosmos gave way to a sense of a grave danger, a terrible responsibility. The night was favored with the light of the moon or the stars. The sentry could have at least some small sense of what was out there. Full darkness, however, was a source of hallucinations. Tree trunks could become human forms, and dark spots could seem to move. One could merely suspect that he had heard something of danger, and the sound of a broken twig could startle the beat of his heart. And in the winter, the nights were 14 hours long, and there was no lasting relief from the cold. The end of the ordeal is heralded now, Seeger wrote, by the morning star. In the last hours of darkness, amid the summer constellations just beginning to appear, the beautiful planet rises, marvelous, resplendent. Not long after the green glow of dawn mantles over the east, the landscape begins to grow visible. The black spots come out in all their innocuous detail. Seeger had first come to public attention in a series of articles from the trenches he had written for the New York Sun, and his platform was enlarged in early 1915 with an essay published in the New Republic entitled As a Soldier Thinks of War. New Republic was a startup magazine then by his classmate Walter Lippmann, and it was a progressive journal, and progressives believed in the American entrance into World War II. First paragraphs of the article were almost painfully melancholic. The winter was over, but all the fruits of spring could be destroyed literally and poetically by the shells of war. In this time of renewal, the young soldier had to think of his possible death. Memories of the best of his life were bittersweet, perhaps never to be revisited. The night sentry prayed for the dawn, thus increasing the brevity of his youth, and the sense of its vanishing opportunities for happiness plagues his heart with a poignancy of regret that at times becomes almost intolerable. But as the medieval knight, Seeger believed that the fighting of war was the duty and pleasure of the individual and his strengths, and that war was a natural condition of the universe of man, whose fate was preordained, not much point to worry about it. It was inevitable in his case, and as he described in his most famous poem, I Have a Rendezvous with Death.
Silk and scented down.
Okay. Death is nothing terrible after all, he had written to his mother. It may mean something even more wonderful than life. It cannot possibly mean anything worse to the good soldier. So do not be unhappy, but no matter what happens, walk with your head held high and glory in your large share of whatever credit the world may give me. But Sigurd wasn't entirely complacent about the nature of the war that might bring about his end. This war was not the war of the night, or as it was depicted at the Cluny Museum. The old ways of warfare, in which the individual acting on his own or in concert as the primary weapon of battle, was giving way to the mechanical war, in which the individual was often under the control of external machinery. The way of the night had been replaced by the way of industry, and the way of industry and materialism was antithetical to the way of the night. Sigurd described the contradiction in what would be one of the war reports that he would write for the New York Sun. His style of warfare is extremely modern, and for the artilleryman is doubtless very interesting, but for the poor common soldier it is anything but romantic. His role is simply to dig himself a hole in the ground and to keep hidden in it as tightly as possible. Continually under the fire of the opposing batteries, he is yet never allowed to get a glimpse of the enemy. Exposed to all the dangers of war, but with none of its enthusiasms or splendid élan, he is condemned to sit like an animal in its burrow and hear the shells whistle over his head and take their little daily toll from his comrades. And Sigurd had come to believe that America would eventually have to fight. Let America beware of the hour when her long isolation from the currents of world politics shall be at an end, when her most vital interests suddenly brought into conflict with those of a powerful rival. She must play her part among nations that have not had the leisure to dwell much upon prospects of what is most comfortable and agreeable to humanity. ... Let her be aware of that hour, lest the alternative to war be not peace, but dishonor. This wasn't a condition that Sigurd belabored in a very public way, but into the 1930s, the sum total of his expression as an American member of the French Foreign Legion would be credited by the people of France as an almost beloved influence on the needed American decision to go to war. After the New Republic essay, Sigurd's next public exposure was the publication of his poem Champagne, 1914-1915, in the fall of 1915. With maybe a few small exceptions, it was the only one of his poems published in his lifetime about the death of the First Battle of Champagne. It's old-fashioned rhyming couplet stuff, but it was a powerful debut, just part of it here. There the grape pickers at their harvesting shall lightly tread and load their wicker trays, blessing his memory, the fallen soldier, as they toil and sing in the slant sunshine of October days. Honor them not so much with tears and flowers, but you with whom the sweet fulfillment lies, wherein the anguish of atrocious hours turn their last thoughts and close their dying eyes. Rather, when music on bright gathering lays its tender spell and joy is uppermost, be mindful of the men they were and raise your glasses to them in one silent toast. Drink to them, amorous of dear earth as well. They ask no tribute lovelier than this, and in the wine that ripened where they fell, oh, frame your lips as though it were a kiss. Sigurd was a participant in the Second Battle of Champagne, and when it was erroneously reported in the national press that he had been killed in the fight, it was that poem that most accounts held as the marker of who had been lost. My research suggests that his poem, Have a Rendezvous with Death, was written in dreary, cold, and muddy Crèvecoeur in February of 1916. In the last months of his life, Sigurd took 2 months of sick leave, perhaps a recurrence of his childhood scarlet fever in Biarritz and here in his beloved Paris for the last time. He had been asked by a Franco-American group urging American entrance into the war to write an American Memorial Day poem that he would recite before the statue of Lafayette and Washington at the Place des Italiens. A bureaucratic snafu kept him from the event. He was very disappointed. And the poem, Ode to American Volunteers Fallen for France, would not be read at the Place des Italiens until the dedication of the monument to American volunteers there in 1923, recited beneath the statue of Alan Seeger at its top. Seeger's best friend in the Legion was an Egyptian, Rif Bear, and his last leave at Paris, after that last leave, Bear found his friend walking in the woods in a happy mood. By Bear's account, Seeger repeated once again his sentiment that life is only beautiful if divided between war and love, and told him that he had known the full beauty of love in the previous weeks. There's a side story that I think I'm the only one who's ever discovered about a young woman invited in Biarritz. And now he wanted to make war, a fine war, a war of bayonet charges, the desperate pursuit of an enemy in flight, the entry as a conqueror with trumpets sounding into a town that we delivered. Those are the delights of war, where in the civil life can be found any emotion so fine and strong as those. Before his leave, he had been increasingly observed by others to have taken dangerous chances, like venturing on his own into no man's land in the spirit of taunting the enemy. He wanted to fight, and the first battle of the Somme was now looming ahead. From the beginning of the war, the two sides became entrenched against each other in a curving line east of Reims in the south, north through Soissons, Albert, and Ypres, Belgium to the coast near Ostend. This would be the Battle of the Somme, another attempt to move that line back toward Germany. The result, however, would be an Allied gain at just 1 point of 7 miles with the cost of 1.2 million men on both sides, Alan Seeger among them. For his regiment, the fight would take place at Beloeil-en-Santerre, just south of Péronne, and on the 4th of July, 1916, the charge was ordered. I caught sight of Seeger and called to him, wrote Rif Bear, making a sign with my hand. He answered with a smile how pale he was. His tall silhouette stood out against the green of the cornfield. He was the tallest man in his section, his head erect and pride in his eye. I saw him running forward with the bayonet fixed. Soon he disappeared, and that was the last I saw of my friend. By other accounts, he was singing as he charged, an old German English drinking song. And when he was hit, he urged his fellows on with a smile on his face. And it might seem too glib to observe, as millions of writers have, that he indeed had met his rendezvous with death. But he did. And I believe, after all of this, that he wished and welcomed his death in this promise. And as his brother, the composer and musicologist, father of anti-war activist Peggy and Pete Seeger, Charles Seeger Jr. told a biography, his favorite game as a child was where he played a knight on a pre-doomed quest against impossible odds. Alan's knight always died nobly. In a way, I suppose he was enacting his own future. I hope that readers will find that the book explores much more fully than I can here the psychology and the adventure of this young man and in the context of that time, and it's very relevant in this time, I believe. The conclusion I come to is that in coming to death, Alan Seeger came fully to life. And that's also pretty glib, but his is an almost unique story about one man's relationship with war, and I've only touched here on some of it. He came to life in a number of ways after his death. His letters and diary and poems to books published in 1916 and 1917 were very well received, although a couple of years later you picked one up for 25 cents at a secondhand bookstore. The poetry, though, was considered kind of old-fashioned. However, among the young dead poets, none died more beloved of the gods, said an essay in the Revue des Deux Mondes here in Paris. He had accepted life as a glorious gift, and his poems had been hymns to the beauty of the world. Even the existence of evil and pain could not obscure his view of the splendor of the universe. The books enjoyed healthy sales into the early 1920s, and the royalties were dedicated to 1/3 of the startup budget of this library in 1919 and 1920. That was the amount of about 50,000 francs. 30,000 in the first year and 20,000 in the second year. If the library created an Alan Seeger endowment, does it still exist? Don't answer that. The library itself is the potential subject of another blockbuster book. And chapter 1 of this book would be about a Frenchman known as the father of ventriloquism in the 1850s. That'll get you going. His father, Charles Seeger Jr., was a founding member of the library, and he wrote, "Our son loved books and he loved Paris as well. We cannot think of any better employment for the sums derived from his verse and his press than to help, even though in a small way, to found a library, which is destined to be the home for lovers of English books in the city in which he lived and to which he was so devoted." The library returned with profound and sympathetic appreciation of all that it signifies for you and for the library, which is thus honored by lasting association with the name of the glorious young poet, your son. This library brought here for our soldiers will always maintain a living memorial to those of our land who fought and died in the fields of France. It is therefore singularly fitting that its first considerable endowment should commemorate one who is presently the spokesman of his generation of ardent and generous American youth. It was believed by the French that Seeger had not only made the ultimate sacrifice for the country, but that he had been an influence in the much hoped for eventual decision by the U.S. to enter the war in 1917, which led to the placement of his likeness atop the monument to the American volunteers fallen for France in 1923, still in place at the Place, although the statue was vandalized in 1912 and taken down and replaced. A tree was planted in his honor on Washington Square, and a whole forest, Pennsylvania Forest, was named for him both in 1921. The tree is gone from Washington Square, the forest is still there. In 1922, his parents donated a church bell to Beloeil-en-Santerre and probably 1,000 fruit trees to help redevelop the agriculture of the surrounding region. And one of those trees is still standing behind the city hall in Beloeil-en-Santerre. It looks very old and tired and decrepit, like I feel sometimes. I was privileged to be in Beloeil-en-Santerre for the centennial observation last year. It also honored two other poets who had died in the same time and place, Camille Campagna of Spain and Reinhard Sohr of Germany. It was quite an event. I want to conclude with Seeger's description of a dream that would not be fulfilled for him, but says and shows everything about Alan Seeger and France. As he traveled and fought around Northeast France, the touchstone for him and his fellows was often the visible from a distance, or imagined to be visible, damaged in 1914 cathedral at Reims. It would be the center of his focus throughout his travels and the source of a fervent desire. In December of 1914, he wrote in the New York Sun, "To dream of re-entering this city as we would re-enter it has filled many a night's watch. The crest opposite us would have been carried at the point of the bayonet. Our ranks would have been thin, but the flag would still wave in the undulating line of blue and red as it winds up the hillside to the town and rolls through the antique gateway, and our officers would look never so gallant riding at the head of each battle-worn company. The midwinter afternoon would bathe in ruddy splendor the beautiful towers and flag-bedecked balconies. From the one would peal forth the thunder of welcoming bells, from the other the acclamation of thousands, the army of deliverance. We would enter the narrow streets of the ancient city. The first stage of our long, victorious advance would be accomplished, and amid the benedictions of a ransomed people, our hearts would dilate with that supreme emotion that life can offer, that emotion idealized on the fields of France, of her revolution and empire, whose name is that of the winged figure that her soldiers love to picture at the head of their victorious battalions, La Gloire, glory.
Exiled afar from youth and quiet love, and death to ravish my fond spirit ends. I have no doubt, but like a hummingbird, it would return to its dear residence, and through a thousand stars find out the road back into earthly flesh that was its loved abode. Exile afar from youth and happy hope, if death should ravish my fond spirit ends, I have no doubt, but like a hummingbird, it will return to its dear residence, and through a thousand stars find out the road back into earthly flesh that was its loved abode.
That was about returning to life or going on with whatever. And, you know, I realized that when you're writing a biography of someone, you're really being very presumptuous. And I also came across the idea of sort of becoming a parent to this person that you're writing, especially a man who died young. And that's very conflicting because if you're a parent, you're not always objective. But you do presume to take on someone's life and take responsibility for that. And if you're writing a book, that's one thing. But if you're composing an oratorio, it seems to me that's quite another thing that's perhaps more difficult because the composer's job is to get the essence of a subject and then turn it around and recreate it in some very essential way without the benefit of words, well, there are lyrics, but to say, all right, now listener, this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. Does that describe your experience? And if it does, what was the essence, what was your essence for Seeger?
I guess I don't feel the same sense of paternal sort of bond with Seeger that you seem to, but for me, his words have a symbolic significance that's very important, I think. He talks, his ideas about, the sort of nobility of self-sacrifice are a bit, perhaps a bit fusty, but maybe should be talked about more in this day and age where we have a lot that we take for granted, perhaps. And so I think it's really important to give his ideas a voice in this time in which we live. So that's sort of the interest for me in using his poetry as really a springboard for sort of offering these kind of ideas in music and sort of.
Right. And another thing about Seeger is what is he in relationship to war? And you and I had a recent exchange in which I think we sort of disagreed. I believe that Alan Seeger fully believed in a righteous war, and that would be merit his death, and that was perfectly fine. It was the right thing to do. And that if you look into who he was and how he went about this, it gives you, I hope it gives you yet another perspective on this problem of war, which I think is inevitable. You saw it differently.
Well, I'm trying to recall the exact conversation we had.
The word warmongering came into our discussion.
Well, he seemed rather gung-ho for war, which is like sort of odd, you know. Doesn't really, it's weird from the contemporary perspective. And in fact, one of the pieces that I set to music, this ode to the fallen soldiers has some of that some sort of kind of Nietzschean, angry, righteous, or sort of beyond post-righteous kind of fervor about violence. So yeah, it doesn't really that doesn't really strike so much of a chord with the contemporary sensibility, and yet there's a lot of violence that sort of underlies what the freedoms that we enjoy today. It's not something that there's a history to having nice discussions at beautiful libraries. You know, without a lot of sacrifice of a lot of people, we wouldn't be able to do this. I think it's something it's good to bear in mind.
It's the likeness of Seeger, and the statue was done by Houdin, is a very famous sculptor in France at the time who did wars of sculptures all over the country. And in the book, there's a picture of him modeling that. When I say it's not meant to be a statue of Seeger. It was meant to be a likeness of Seeger, to be representative of all of the American men. "50,000 Americans fought in World War I, not in American forces. Most of about 35,000 of them in the British Commonwealth forces. They all started going. They started in 1914 upon the German invasion of Belgium. They were going to Canada to join the UK. And Seeger and his friends, a lot of them from Harvard University and Yale, upon the invasion, they were here in Paris, where the American ambassador, they asked the American, Myron Herrick, the American ambassador to France, whether it was legal for them to join the French army in this war. And he said, he took out the book and he said, no, it's not. But by God, I know what I would do. And so Seeger was just one of these people, but he's very, as I always say, he was a very minor character in 2 pages of my last 2 books. And then I realized he was the central character in the whole story. That's why we have this book. I found, in doing research for this book, I found in the archives at the University of Virginia, of all things, and I live in Virginia, a letter written by a young woman unnamed about an encounter with Seeger in Biarritz that nobody else had ever known about. And there are a whole lot of stories here, and you don't want to get started, we're running out of time, but also in the book there was a woman in the United States in the 20s through the 50s, Putnam was her name, and she was a newspaper columnist. She was sort of a Dorothy Kilgallen type. She wrote books and plays and wrote the screen treatment for the movie The Mummy. and also designed our current IRS 1040 tax form. This is Putnam, I forget the rest of her name. She wrote a biography in 1933 in which she claimed that Seeger had been in love with her, had stalked her all over New York City, had walked 90 miles up to Connecticut to see her, even though her husband, she was married, and so on. And she said, and he wrote many sonnets out of his love for me. Well, there are some love sonnets in his work. They could not have been written for her. I think they were written for the woman, for the girl in Biarritz.
And was the girl in Biarritz American or French or?
Yes, she was, and she was. He was in Biarritz to recoup from. He was in the hospital, and she was not a nurse, but she worked in the hospital. Although we're not clear whether he was in the hospital. Anyhow, they met in a garden, and they had a very intense, according to her, very chaste letter affair of the mind. But according to his sonnets, maybe not, you know. But there's not a lot out there about Seeger and women. There's Putnam's story. He was a stalker. And the Biarritz story, and not much else. His brother, in his brother's biography, he said that at Harvard there was a very favorite brothel in Boston that the Harvard guys always went to, and that Seeger always went along, but he sat in the parlor and observed the people going up the stairs, and never did himself. He was, when he was killed, he was buried ostensibly in a hill outside of Boulogne-Santerre, and a year later that hill was gone. And the French government, and this says a lot about his relationship to France, the French government looked for his body officially until 1931, and it gave up the search. And then some Americans went over there, and they began to look for him also, without any real success. But eventually it came to be accepted that his body, his bones, it would be his bones, were gathered with others on this hill out of Boulogne-Santerre, and that they now rest in the National Cemetery at Lyon. But in the ossuary there, but when I was at the ossuary there in 2015, his name was not on the list of people whose bones were in that ossuary. And when I went back to that ossuary a year later in 2016, when they're having this big deal about Alan at Boulogne-Santerre and so on, his name had been added to the ossuary, but the inscription wasn't necessarily sort of fresh looking, and it was kind of off-center from all of the other names. So it's believed that his bones are there. His family was never, they weren't sentimental, but it was a very, very strong family. But they didn't seem to be sent. They were giving the church bell to Boulogne-Santerre, planting the trees. That was it. The library here, that was important. His bones, not so much. Well, he wrote it in February of 1916. He'd already been through it, and he was 5 months from his own death. But a more important poem in that regard is the Ode to American Volunteers poem for France, which he wrote he was to recite here, and that wasn't because the Foreign Legion made a bureaucratic error, didn't give him leave to do it. But that is the poem, and I would recite some reason of it, but I can't from my head, and we're out of time. That is the poem that was considered to be the Alan Seeger poem that was about the virtue of war. And yeah, he saw all this stuff. His experience in war wasn't that awful in terms of being shot at and stuff like that, and it was more boring than it was anything else. Just sitting all day long in a trench, nothing to do. And he would describe it as, how was war for you, Alan? It was boring, probably, is what he would say. I'm being presumptuous again. Charles Seeger was a very smart man who finished first in his class in Springfield, Massachusetts, and the town fathers of Springfield suggested he should go to Harvard and they would pay his way, and his mother said seniors don't accept charity, and so Charles, one of the founders of this library, had a high school education. And so on. And he set out, and someone gave him a job as a banker, and he decided banking wasn't for him. He'd never made a fortune doing it. And he set off for Mexico. And 5 years later, he had started one of the main newspapers in Mexico. He had published a book with a partner, Fred Guernsey, who was a Boston Globe reporter, of 4,000 manufactured things that manufactured in this country, and so on. He was in sugar refinery. He played a role in the development of railroads in Mexico. He played a role in the electrification of Mexico, of transportation in Mexico City, from oxen to streetcars. He had an auto dealership, an electric car auto dealership. He paved the streets in Mexico City, and then he started selling the cars that were going on. And then he worked for American Rubber here in Paris and in New York, and so on. And by the time he got to the library here, he was a very wealthy man who had been all over the place. And then later on, he wrote the introduction to a book by some obscure Russian academic. That was Charles Singer Sr. He's also another book.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.